Okay, so I am recording as I go through. Um, Jot down any questions that you have, and we'll ask them at the end if that's okay, since I am recording. Okay, so this is our essay number 2. This is the process essay. So, what is process? It's going to explain how to do something or how something occurs or happens. You are going to present a sequence of steps and show how those steps lead to a particular result. So, process presents events in a chronological order. If you're telling somebody how to make cornbread, you don't want to start with taking it out of the oven. You need to start at the very beginning. So that's kind of like a narrative. However, this is something that's going to explain something that produces the same outcome whenever it's duplicated. So here's, excuse me, here are a couple of examples of types of process. So you have either instructions or explanations. If you are doing instructions, you're basically teaching your readers how to do something. Here's a recipe. A recipe is an example of an instructional process. And then process explanation is just, how does this happen? How does the Electoral College vote work? How does photosynthesis work? How does the life cycle of the 17-year cicadas work? That's an explanation that you're going to tell. So one's going to result in your readers learning how to do something, and the other one's going to result in your readers understanding how something works. So this is how to change oil. Everybody needs to know how to do that. But you see that it has 1, 2, 3. It's numbered. The recipe is laid out almost like a bulleted list. We're going to write it as an essay, though, make it a little bit more interesting. Okay, I already went through this. The instructions enable readers to perform something, and it's very practical. With instructions, you will use the present tense. Usually the present passive tense can mix in there with the active. And you can use you, but that's a little bit elementary for you all. Try using the imperative mood. That's where you speak directly to the reader without necessarily using the pronoun you. For example, instead of saying you need to disconnect the system and check the electrical source, just say disconnect the system and check the electrical source. Remember, an imperative sentence is kind of a command, an instruction, an order. For process explanation, you're really not helping the readers to perform anything. You're helping them understand. Some examples are how silkworms spin cocoons, how Michelangelo and Leonardo painted their masterpieces on plaster walls. How does one paint a fresco? What does that mean? That would be an example. You can employ the first person or the third person for the process explanation, but remember that the readers just need to understand. They don't need to do it themselves. And you can use the past tense or the present. For this one, present is more effective. So, the style of process varies depending on whether or not you're explaining a process that happens regularly, like photosynthesis, or something that happened in the past that doesn't really happen anymore. Like how was the railroad across the American West built? That would be something in the past. All right. So process explanation, you can use the first person or the third person. I gave you some examples there. You can use the past tense. After I placed this on the tray, I turned out the light. So this is a process performed in the past by the writer. After the photographer placed the chemicals in the tray, she turned out the lights in the dark room, and that's something that's performed by somebody else. So that's why it's third person. Okay, so things to consider. What are you trying to explain? Why is it important? What does the process affect? Are there different ways of doing the process? If so, what are they? Who are your readers? Now, for this one, I do want you to kind of pretend that your readers know nothing and they really have to be explained. You have to explain things in minute detail. What skills or equipment does one have to have for this? How long does it take? Is it always the same, the outcome? How many steps are there in the process? And then also things to consider is, why is each step important? Which are more important than others? How can you overcome any difficulties or challenges? Do you need to caution your readers about something? Are there any words, any definitions that you need to clarify, especially since we're pretending your readers know nothing? And are there other processes that are similar that you could use as examples to illustrate the process that you are writing about? Okay. All right, I'm not going to go through this again. But I do want to point out this last bullet point. If you go back through the slideshow later when you're drafting, your responses to all those questions and statements should help you to write a really effective process paper. Going back to this other bullet point, I do prefer that you avoid using the second person you. If we were in middle school, I would say, okay, go ahead and use you. But I would prefer that you use the imperative voice because this is college. All right, so do's and don'ts. Choosing a topic. Don't write about something that's too complicated. I have provided 6 prompts that you can choose from. If you don't like any of those prompts and you want to do your own process, that's fine with me. Just check it with me first so I can make sure that it's suitable for this paper. Don't try to write a brief process essay. This is going to be the same as our narrative, couple pages. You can do a 5-paragraph essay minimum if you want to. If it's something that takes an instructional manual that's this thick, don't try to write a 2-page paper about it. Choose something that's simple. And don't write something that needs a lot of visual aids. If you do need to put in a couple of pictures, that's okay. If you're going to need a video or charts and graphs, try something different. Yeah, this is a good example. If you try explaining the process of tying your shoes without actually having a visual aid, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Okay, now transitions. Sean, the cute Canadian, did touch on this a bit. Be careful when you're making connections between your sentences. There is a temptation to go, and then, next. Now, if Auntie Gloria is telling you how to make her famous meatloaf, that's awesome, but it's not going to make a good, interesting essay. Look for a variety of transitional words, phrases, tags that you can use. Also, it's really tempting to go first, second, third, fourth, fifth. But again, that's kind of like blah, 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 blah. So, you can say first and second and then let the numbering go and play with words, have some fun with it. And you can use some, like the recipe and the steps in changing the oil of the car. Those are called graphical embellishments, bullets, dashes, things like that. Don't do that for this essay because the point is for you to write things out. Okay, yeah, let the language do the work for you. Oh, okay, talking about meatloaf, which now makes me want meatloaf. Don't use abbreviations. Like if you choose to do a recipe and you're explaining how to make something, don't use abbreviations. Spell those words out. Okay, we talked about this. We talked about doing it in chronological order. All right. Here are some transitions that you can use. Put together a couple tables for you. Again, this slideshow is on Canvas. So if you want to open that up and take a look at these as you're writing, some transitional words that show order, and are a bit more interesting and more complex than just first, second, third, then next, 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 next. Have some fun with those. Those are here for your use. All right, so again, with the do's and don'ts, the thing about these essays, they are pretty easy. I would say the hardest part is to make them interesting. You don't want your readers to wander off or start looking at their Insta or something like that. Involve them in it. Make sure that you appeal to like just the humanity of your reader, and entertain them. Let them know that this is important. So one thing to do to think about is if you're going to write about how to jumpstart a dead car battery, which everybody needs to know how to do, and I hope you know how to do it. Don't start with the process. Don't start with hooking up the cables. Start with a scenario. Start with a dark, snowy morning in the parking lot in the Coppin Heights neighborhood of Baltimore, and you need to get to Columbia, Maryland. There's no garage around. You're on a deadline. It's cold. It's sleeting. And you have to jump your car. So how do you hook these stupid cables up that you find in the trunk? If you're going to start writing about how to make a souffle, don't start with the eggs. Start with a scenario. How would you feel if your mother-in-law came over for dinner and your souffle came out looking like a pile of scrambled eggs instead of a souffle? You know, build up this thing and say, well, we can, anybody can avoid this. Don't let this happen. This is how you make a souffle. So they may not, I may not be interested in car batteries. I may not be interested in souffles, but if you give them this dimension of the human condition, you're being stuck, you're miserable, you're in the sleet and snow, and you need to get somewhere, or you get embarrassed because you planned this wonderful meal to impress somebody and it turns out like poo on a plate. You can grab them with that. Okay, so don't be monotonous. That's another thing. I know that that's ironic that I'm saying don't be monotonous when I'm going through a slideshow, which can be very monotonous. Make sure that some of your steps stand out from others. All steps in a process are usually not equally important. So make sure that you reiterate which ones are important. And that's where you can actually attach some anecdotal information, like what's going to happen if you do this. And also, it's nice to attach a special warning or alert to one of your steps. Like, with the car cables, if you don't connect the positive pole to the positive pole, when you're jumping a car, you know what could happen. You can actually cause a big explosion, or you can melt your battery. Don't turn your crock pot on low and it needs to be on high, or else it will turn into egg-colored cement, something like that. Yeah, that's again when you can put some of that human dimension in to make sure that your readers stay engaged. Okay, so watch those pronouns. If you frame a reference, if your frame of reference has been yourself, if that anecdote that you start off with is you and you use I, be consistent with that. And don't shift those perspectives. It can confuse your reader and make your essay choppy. right, that's it. I'm going to close this out. Oops, cancel. And I need to stop